Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The biting cold of the northern frontier clung to Hill like a second skin as he trudged through the snow-covered landscape. Frosthaven, his hometown, lay behind him, its fortifications barely visible through the flurry of snow. The air was thick with the promise of a storm, and the wind howled like a restless beast, whipping around Hill's fur-lined cloak. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale forming a cloud that was quickly snatched away by the relentless wind. Hill was a young man of 25, but the weight of his mission made him feel years older. He had always been known for his skill with a blade, earning the title of Frost Swordsman, but today, he was not marching toward another battle. He was heading toward the frozen pinnacle, the heart of enemy territory, to seek peace with the ice dragons, creatures that had been the bane of his people for as long as he could remember. The town of Frosthaven had been a battleground for generations. The townspeople lived in constant fear of the ice dragons that dwelled in the mountains to the north, powerful beings capable of freezing entire villages with their icy breath. The elders spoke of a time before the war, a time when humans and dragons coexisted peacefully, but that time had long since faded into myth. Now, the relationship between the two races was defined by bloodshed and hatred, a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to break, yet, Hill believed otherwise. He had seen too many lives lost, too much suffering, and he refused to accept that war was the only path. The decision to embark on this journey was not an easy one. His mentor, Garen, had warned him of the dangers. Garen was an old man, a veteran of countless battles, and he had seen firsthand the destruction the dragons could wreak. But even Garen, with all his wisdom and experience, knew that the cycle of hatred could not continue. When Hill had spoken of his plan to seek peace with the ice dragons, Garen had not tried to dissuade him. Instead, he had handed Hill his own sword, a blade that had seen the blood of many dragons, and told him to follow his heart. With that blessing, Hill had set out alone, leaving behind his family and the life he knew. The journey to the frozen pinnacle was not just a physical one, it was a test of his resolve, a pilgrimage that would force him to confront his deepest fears and doubts. The road ahead was treacherous, filled with dangers both natural and unnatural. But Hill's determination was unyielding, and he pressed on through the blizzard, his thoughts focused on the mission ahead. As he ascended the mountains, the snow grew deeper, the wind colder. The landscape around him transformed into a world of ice and stone, stark and unforgiving. The trees that once lined the path were now twisted, their branches heavy with frost, and the ground beneath his feet was slick with ice. Hill's progress was slow, each step a battle against the elements. But he knew he could not turn back. The fate of his people depended on him, and he would not fail them. It was on the third day of his journey that Hill encountered the first real challenge. He had been following a narrow path along a ridge when the ground suddenly gave way beneath him. He tumbled down the slope, his body battered by rocks and ice, until he landed in a snowdrift at the bottom of a ravine. Dazed and bruised, Hill struggled to his feet, only to find himself surrounded by a pack of wolves. Their fur was as white as the snow, their eyes gleaming with hunger. Hill knew he was in their territory, and they would not let him pass without a fight. Drawing his sword, Hill faced the wolves. They circled him, snarling, their breath visible in the frigid air. Hill's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his focus. He had fought wolves before, but these were different, larger, more feral. They moved with a grace and speed that spoke of countless battles in the harsh wilderness. The leader of the pack lunged at him, and Hill sidestepped, bringing his sword down in a swift arc. The blade met its mark, but the wolf twisted away, leaving only a shallow cut. The pack closed in, and Hill knew he had to end this quickly. With a roar, he charged at the nearest wolf, his sword flashing in the dim light. The wolf leapt to meet him, and Hill slashed at its throat, the blade slicing through fur and flesh. The wolf fell, blood staining the snow, but there was no time to celebrate the victory. The rest of the pack attacked, and Hill found himself fighting for his life. He moved with precision, each strike calculated, each movement deliberate. The battle was fierce, but Hill's training and determination saw him through. One by one, the wolves fell until only the leader remained. The leader was larger than the others, its eyes glowing with a fierce intelligence. It circled Hill, wary now, as if it recognized that this was no ordinary human. Hill held his ground, waiting for the wolf to make its move. It snarled, baring its teeth, and then lunged. Hill sidestepped again, but this time, the wolf anticipated the move. It twisted in midair, slashing at Hill with its claws. Hill felt the pain as the claws raked across his chest, but he ignored it, focusing on the kill. With a swift motion, he brought his sword up and drove it into the wolf's heart. The beast let out a final howl before collapsing at Hill's feet, breathing heavily. Hill stood over the fallen wolf, his sword still embedded in its chest. The snow around him was stained with blood, both his and the wolves'. He was wounded, but he was alive. With a grunt, he pulled his sword free and wiped the blade on the wolf's fur. The pack was defeated, but Hill knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Hill's injuries slowed him down, but he pressed on, determined to reach the frozen pinnacle. The landscape grew more treacherous as he ascended, the path narrowing until it was little more than a ledge on the side of the mountain. The wind was relentless, threatening to throw him off balance with every step. But Hill's resolve was unshakable. He had come too far to turn back now. As the sun set on the fourth day, Hill reached a plateau overlooking a vast expanse of ice. In the distance, he could see the frozen pinnacle, a massive peak that seemed to pierce the sky itself. The mountain was shrouded in clouds, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural cold. Hill knew he was close. But before he could continue, he needed to rest. Finding shelter in a small cave, Hill built a fire and tended to his wounds. The cut on his chest was deep, and he knew it would take time to heal. But time was a luxury he didn't have. As he sat by the fire, warming his hands, his thoughts drifted to the task ahead. Negotiating with the ice dragons was a daunting prospect. They were ancient, powerful beings, and Hill was just a man. But he had to try. The fate of his people depended on it. As he drifted off to sleep, Hill's mind was filled with images of dragons, their scales shimmering in the light, their eyes burning with cold fire. He dreamed of the frozen pinnacle, of standing before the Dragon Lord and pleading for peace. But the dream was fragmented, filled with shadows and uncertainty. Hill awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire had died down to embers, and the cave was filled with darkness. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, and Hill knew that the final leg of his journey would be the most difficult. The next morning, Hill set out early, determined to reach the frozen pinnacle by nightfall. The path was steep and treacherous, but Hill moved with purpose, his eyes fixed on the peak ahead. The air grew colder with each step, and soon, Hill could see his breath-forming clouds in front of him. The landscape was desolate, a world of ice and stone, and Hill felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on him. But he pushed on, driven by a sense of duty and a desire for peace. It was midday when Hill encountered the mysterious wanderer. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from behind a boulder as if she had been waiting for him. She was tall and slender, with long silver hair that flowed down her back like a river of ice. Her eyes were a striking shade of blue, almost too vivid to be natural, and she wore a cloak of white fur that blended seamlessly with the snow around her. Hill stopped in his tracks, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the surprise. The woman smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I've been waiting for you, Hill of Frosthaven." Hill narrowed his eyes. "How do you know my name?" Lyra tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "I know many things. I know you seek peace with the ice dragons. I know you carry the hopes of your people on your shoulders. And I know that you will not reach the frozen pinnacle on your own." Hill felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something about Lyra that unsettled him, something beyond her sudden appearance in this desolate place. But he couldn't afford to let fear or doubt cloud his judgment. He was too close to his goal. "What do you want?" Hill asked, his grip on his sword tightening. Lyra's smile faded slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "I want to help you, Hill. The journey you've undertaken is dangerous, and you will face trials that no ordinary human could survive. But with my guidance, you may have a chance." Hill studied her, his instincts telling him to be cautious. "Why would you want to help me?" "There are many reasons," Lyra replied, her voice soft but steady. "But the most important one is that I, too, desire peace between our races." Hill's eyes widened slightly. "Our races?" Lyra nodded. "I am not entirely human, Hill. My mother was one of your kind, but my father was a dragon." Hill's mind reeled at the revelation. Half human, half dragon, it was something out of legend, a story told to children. But as he looked into Lyra's eyes, he saw the truth in her words. The vivid blue of her eyes, the unnatural grace with which she moved, it all made sense now. "If what you say is true, then you should understand why this mission is so important," Hill said, trying to keep his voice calm. "The hatred between humans and dragons has gone on for too long. It has to end." Lyra's expression softened, and for the first time, Hill saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "I do understand, Hill. That's why I'm offering my help. But you must trust me, and trust is something that doesn't come easily between our peoples." Hill hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had come this far on his own, relying on his skills and determination. But the path ahead was unknown, filled with dangers he couldn't foresee. If Lyra truly wanted to help, then perhaps he could use her guidance. "All right," Hill said finally. "I'll accept your help. But know this, if you betray me, I won't hesitate to defend myself." Lyra's smile returned, though it was tinged with sadness. "I understand, Hill. But I have no intention of betraying you. My goal is the same as yours." With that, Lyra turned and began to lead the way up the mountain. Hill followed, his senses on high alert. As they ascended, the landscape grew more treacherous. The snow was deeper here, the wind more biting. The path was narrow, with sheer drops on either side, and the clouds above seemed to hang lower, dark and ominous. They moved in silence for a time, each step bringing them closer to the frozen pinnacle. Hill's thoughts were a whirlwind of questions and doubts. Who was Lyra, really? What was her true motive? And most importantly, could she be trusted? As if sensing his unease, Lyra spoke without turning. "You're wondering if you made the right decision, aren't you?" Hill didn't answer immediately. "I'd be a fool not to have doubts," he said finally. "But I'm willing to take the risk if it means a chance for peace." Lyra glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "You're brave, Hill. Braver than most. But bravery alone won't see you through what's ahead." They continued onward, the mountain growing steeper with each passing moment. The air was thin, making it difficult to breathe, and the cold was so intense that it seeped into Hill's bones despite his thick clothing. But he pressed on, his resolve unwavering. It wasn't long before they reached a plateau, a flat expanse of ice and snow that stretched out before them. In the distance, the frozen pinnacle loomed, its jagged peaks piercing the sky. But what caught Hill's attention were the figures standing at the edge of the plateau, massive, winged creatures with scales that shimmered in the dim light, the ice dragons. Hill's heart raced as he took in the sight of them. There were 3 in total, their bodies coiled and poised like serpents ready to strike. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their breath steamed in the cold air, forming clouds of frost. Hill had seen dragons before, but never this close, never so menacing. Lyra raised a hand, signaling for Hill to stop. "These are the sentinels," she said quietly. "They guard the entrance to the Dragon Lord's lair. We'll need to convince them to let us pass." Hill swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "And how do we do that?" "By showing them that we mean no harm," Lyra replied. She stepped forward, her posture relaxed but confident, and began to speak in a language that Hill couldn't understand. The words were melodic, almost like a song, and as she spoke, the dragons seemed to listen, their glowing eyes fixed on her. Hill stood still, his hand hovering near his sword. The dragons made no move to attack, but their presence was intimidating, their sheer size and power overwhelming. Hill could feel their eyes on him, could sense their intelligence. These were not mindless beasts, they were ancient, wise, and deadly. After a moment, one of the dragons responded, its voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like thunder. Hill couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, wary, but not hostile. Lyra turned back to Hill, her expression serious. "They'll allow us to pass, but only because of my heritage. They still don't trust you, Hill. You'll need to prove yourself to the Dragon Lord." Hill nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I'm ready." They moved past the sentinels, who watched them with unblinking eyes. As they continued toward the pinnacle, Hill couldn't shake the feeling that they were being judged, that every step was being weighed and measured by forces beyond his comprehension. The entrance to the Dragon Lord's lair was a massive archway carved into the side of the mountain, its edges lined with ice that glittered like diamonds. As they approached, Hill could feel the temperature drop even further, the air so cold it burned his lungs. But he didn't falter. This was what he had come for. Lyra led the way through the archway, into a vast cavern that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were lined with crystals that emitted a soft, pale light, casting the chamber in an ethereal glow. At the far end of the cavern, on a raised platform of ice, sat the Dragon Lord, Vildren. Hill had heard stories of Vildren, the ancient ruler of the ice dragons, but nothing had prepared him for the sight before him. Vildren was enormous, his body covered in scales of pure white that shimmered with an otherworldly light. His eyes were the color of the deepest ice, and they radiated power and wisdom. His wings were folded against his back, but even in repose, he exuded an aura of authority that filled the cavern. Hill felt a wave of awe and fear wash over him. This was no ordinary dragon, this was a being of immense power, a creature that had lived for centuries, perhaps millennia. And here he was, a mere human, standing before him, asking for peace. Vildren's gaze fixed on Hill, and for a moment, the young swordsman felt as though he was being stripped bare, his very soul laid open for the Dragon Lord to see. There was no hiding, no deception in the presence of such a being who dares to enter my domain. Vildren's voice boomed through the cavern, reverberating off the walls like a shockwave. It was a voice that commanded attention, that brooked no defiance. Hill stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "My name is Hill of Frosthaven," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I come to seek peace between our peoples." Vildren's eyes narrowed, and a low rumble emanated from his chest. "Peace? What do you know of peace, human? Your kind has brought nothing but war and destruction to my people." Hill met Vildren's gaze, refusing to be cowed. "The same could be said of your kind," he replied. "But I believe that our enmity has gone on long enough. We have both suffered from this endless conflict, and it is time to find another way." Vildren regarded him for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. "You speak boldly, human. But words are not enough. If you truly seek peace, you must prove your worth." Hill nodded. "I am prepared to do whatever is necessary." Vildren's gaze shifted to Lyra, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "You vouch for this human, Lyra?" Lyra bowed her head. "I do, my lord. I believe he is sincere in his desire for peace." Vildren's eyes flicked back to Hill. "Very well. You will face the trial of the frozen pinnacle. If you succeed, I will consider your proposal." Hill's stomach tightened, but he didn't hesitate. "I accept." The Dragon Lord nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then let the trial begin." With a wave of his massive claw, Vildren summoned the first challenge. The ground beneath Hill trembled, and the air grew colder still. From the shadows at the edge of the cavern, a dragon emerged, smaller than Vildren but still formidable. Its scales were a deep blue, and its eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "This is Aelith," Vildren said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "He is young, but skilled in combat. You will face him in a duel. If you survive, you may continue." Hill drew his sword, his grip steady. A duel with a dragon was a daunting prospect, but he had no choice. This was the first step toward peace, and he would not back down. Aelith circled Hill, his movements fluid and graceful despite his size. The dragon's eyes gleamed with a mix of curiosity and respect. It was clear that Aelith was not underestimating his opponent. Hill kept his stance firm, his sword raised, watching for any sign of an attack. The battle began with a flash of movement as Aelith lunged at Hill, his claws slashing through the air. Hill sidestepped the attack, bringing his sword up to deflect the dragon's next strike. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through Hill's arms, but he held his ground, refusing to be pushed back. Aelith was fast, faster than any opponent Hill had faced before. The dragon's attacks were relentless, a blur of claws and teeth, but Hill moved with precision, dodging and parrying each strike. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the chill of the dragon's breath like a knife in his lungs, but he fought through it, his focus unwavering. Hill's strategy was simple: stay on the defensive, wait for an opening. Aelith was strong, but strength could be turned against him. Hill knew he couldn't match the dragon blow for blow, so he conserved his energy, letting Aelith tire himself out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Hill saw his chance. Aelith overextended in a lunge, and Hill stepped forward, driving his sword into the dragon's side. The blade bit deep, and Aelith let out a roar of pain, stumbling back. But Hill didn't press the attack. Instead, he withdrew, his sword at the ready. Aelith's eyes blazed with fury, but there was also a glint of something else: respect. The dragon straightened, his breathing heavy, and inclined his head slightly. "You are skilled," Human, Aelith said, his voice a deep rumble. I yield. Hill lowered his sword, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse. Vildren watched the exchange with keen interest. You have passed the first trial, Hill of Frosthaven. But the hardest challenges lie ahead. Hill nodded, knowing that this was only the beginning. The physical test was behind him, but now came the trials of wisdom and compassion, trials that would test not just his strength, but his very soul. Vildren gestured to the side of the cavern, where a door of ice had appeared, carved into the wall. Enter, the Dragon Lord commanded. Inside, you will face the second trial. It is a test of wisdom, one that many have failed. If you are truly worthy, you will find the answer. Hill sheathed his sword and walked toward the door. The ice was cold to the touch, but it opened easily under his hand, revealing a dark passage beyond. Hill took a deep breath and stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss. The passage was narrow, the walls lined with crystals that emitted a faint, flickering light. As Hill walked deeper into the tunnel, the air grew warmer, and he could hear the distant sound of water dripping. The floor was uneven, forcing him to tread carefully. At the end of the passage, Hill entered a large chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, and atop it was a glowing orb, its light pulsing softly. Hill approached the pedestal cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he examined the orb. As he drew near, a voice echoed through the chamber, deep and resonant, yet somehow familiar. I am the keeper of knowledge, the guardian of wisdom. If you seek peace, you must prove your understanding. Answer this riddle, and you may proceed. Hill braced himself, knowing that this would not be an easy task. The voice continued, the words reverberating through the chamber. I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. What am I? Hill frowned, considering the riddle. It was deceptively simple, yet the answer eluded him. He paced back and forth, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the words. I speak without a mouth, and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with wind. The answer was on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. He stopped, staring at the orb, willing himself to think clearly. What speaks without a mouth? What hears without ears? Suddenly, it clicked, an echo, Hill said, his voice firm. The answer is an echo. The chamber was silent for a moment, and then the orb's light grew brighter, filling the room with a warm glow. The voice spoke again, this time with a tone of approval. You have answered correctly. You may proceed. The pedestal shifted, and the floor beneath it opened, revealing a staircase leading further down into the mountain. Hill didn't hesitate. He descended the stairs, his heart lighter now that he had passed the second trial. At the bottom of the staircase, Hill found himself in another chamber, this one smaller and more intimate. A fire burned in the center of the room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. But what caught Hill's attention was the figure sitting by the fire, a man, bound in chains, his head bowed in defeat. Hill approached cautiously, and as he drew closer, the man looked up. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he bore the scars of countless battles. Hill recognized him as one of the warriors who had gone missing during the last raid on Frosthaven, a man thought lost to the dragons. The man's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. Please, help me. Hill knelt beside the man, his heart aching at the sight of his suffering. Who did this to you? The man shook his head weakly. It doesn't matter. I tried to fight them, tried to kill them all, but I failed. They captured me, and now I'm just a prisoner. Hill clenched his fists, anger and sorrow mingling in his chest. He had come to seek peace, but seeing one of his own in such a state stirred the old hatred within him. But then he remembered why he was here, what he was fighting for. This is your final trial, Hill of Frosthaven. Vildren's voice echoed through the chamber, though the Dragon Lord was nowhere to be seen. This man is your enemy, but he is also a fellow human. Will you show him mercy, or will you leave him to his fate? Hill looked down at the man, his mind racing. The man had tried to kill the dragons, had undoubtedly caused harm to them. But he was also a victim, a prisoner who had suffered greatly. What would peace mean if it was built on the suffering of others? With a heavy heart, Hill reached out and began to unbind the man's chains. I'm taking you back to Frosthaven, he said, his voice resolute. You don't deserve to be left here to die. The man looked at Hill with wide eyes, tears streaming down his cheeks. Thank you, thank you. As the last of the chains fell away, the fire in the center of the chamber flared, and a doorway of light appeared in the wall. Hill helped the man to his feet, supporting him as they walked through the doorway. On the other side, they found themselves back in the Dragon Lord's cavern, where Vildren awaited them. The Dragon Lord's expression was unreadable, his icy eyes fixed on Hill. You have passed the trials, Hill of Frosthaven, Vildren said, his voice measured. You have proven your strength, your wisdom, and your compassion. I will listen to your proposal. Hill nodded, his heart swelling with hope. He had done it. He had faced the trials and emerged victorious. Now, the real challenge began, negotiating a peace that would bring an end to the centuries of conflict. Hill stood before Vildren, his posture firm but respectful. I propose a truce between our peoples, he said, his voice steady. We can no longer afford to live in fear and hatred. We must work together, share our resources, and protect each other from the dangers that threaten us both. Vildren regarded him silently, the weight of the Dragon Lord's gaze heavy on Hill's shoulders. The silence stretched on, each moment filled with tension. But Hill did not waver. He had come this far, and he would see it through to the end. Finally, Vildren spoke, his voice softer than before. You speak of cooperation, of mutual protection. But how do I know that your people will honor such a truce? How do I know that you will not betray us as others have in the past? Hill met Vildren's gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. I can't promise that there won't be those who will oppose this peace. But I can promise that I will do everything in my power to make sure it holds. We have both lost too much to continue down this path. It's time to build something new. Vildren was silent for a long moment, and then he let out a deep sigh, the sound reverberating through the cavern like a distant storm. Very well, Hill of Frosthaven. I will agree to your truce. But know this, if your people betray us, the consequences will be dire. Hill bowed his head in gratitude. Thank you, Dragon Lord. You have my word that we will honor this agreement. The cavern seemed to brighten as Vildren nodded, and Hill felt a sense of relief wash over him. The hard part was over, but the work had only just begun. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but Hill was ready to face them. He had taken the first step toward peace, and he would see it through to the end. Hill and Lyra left the frozen pinnacle together, the wounded man supported between them. The journey back to Frosthaven was arduous, but Hill's heart was light. As they descended the mountain, the sky began to clear, and the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting the landscape in a golden glow. When they reached Frosthaven, the townspeople were waiting, their faces filled with a mix of awe and disbelief as Hill recounted his journey. The news of the truce spread quickly, and soon, the entire town was buzzing with excitement and hope. For the first time in generations, there was a chance for peace. Hill stood on the ramparts of Frosthaven, looking out over the horizon. The mountains in the distance were bathed in the warm light of dawn, and the air was crisp and clear. It was a new day, a new beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, but Hill was ready to walk it. With Lyra by his side and the promise of a brighter future guiding him, he knew that they could build a world where humans and dragons could live in harmony. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Hill felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. He had faced the trials of the frozen pinnacle, and he had emerged victorious, not just in battle, but in his quest for peace. The journey had changed him, made him stronger, wiser. And now, with the dawn of a new era on the horizon, he was ready to lead his people into the future. The end of the conflict was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one of cooperation, understanding, and hope. Hill smiled as he watched the first ice dragons appear on the horizon, their massive forms silhouetted against the morning sky. They were coming, not as enemies, but as allies, and so, the frozen north, once a land of endless strife, began to thaw. Not just in the physical sense, but in the hearts of those who had once harbored only hatred. It was the start of something new, something better. And it all began with one young swordsman who dared to believe that peace was possible. Hill turned away from the horizon, his heart full of determination. There was much work to be done, but he was ready. He had faced the frozen pinnacle, and he had emerged not just as a warrior, but as a peacemaker. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.